Well, good afternoon, lay missioners. I trust you're doing well. I'm going to begin a lecture today on the topic of the Anglican Church during the Reformation. And what we did last time in our last historical study was to bring you right up to the threshold of the Reformation while Henry VIII still was cooperating with the Bishop of Rome without conflict. And now we come to the time frame when basically the political dimension of the Protestant Reformation in England takes on a different turn. And Henry begins to be in conflict over an heir. And yet at the same time, beneath the surface of things, there is a Reformation taking place within the church in Great Britain. Not Luther, but Erasmus had been here. Other figures from the Reformation had been there, as well as people going to the continent to study. And so there was a burgeoning Reformation right below the surface in Great Britain at the time. But obviously, the impetus for the separation occurs because of Henry VIII and some of his machinations related to trying to have a male heir to the throne. So with that, let me pause for a moment, and I'll bring up the notes for our study. I think everyone who studies this period of history, 1517, I have the dates 1517, 1564. The time of the Reformation was really a complex time. There are a lot of factors going on that really are dynamic. Obviously, the church needed reformation. There was a lot of problems with the Catholic Church. But this is also represented in a lot of the politics of the continental Europe and struggles that were taking place, even changes and possibilities. People were healthier after the plagues. Towns were growing and becoming cities again, and people were trying to move out of serfdom into a middle class being formed. And so a lot of dynamics, socially, economically, politically, were happening. But religiously, it's obviously a very tenuous time. And the Catholic Church was very much enmeshed in every one of these domains. They were very much a part of the feudal system. They owned a lot of the lands in Europe and in Great Britain. And so they were fully participants in this whole process. And so when the Reformation occurs, it's on a religious level, but it also impacts so many different things. And so a couple summary thoughts in this opening paragraph of our notes. The church was in terrible shape, and everyone agreed that change was necessary. The question was, how exactly should that change occur, and who wanted it to occur? And so what we have in the Protestant Reformation is basically a movement that sought to restore the church to its original foundations in Scripture, and as found in the early fathers, as represented by them, particularly in the first 5 centuries, I would say, and really try to rid it of a substantial body of made-up man-made religion, which the Roman Catholic Church has added to it and just piled on and on and on continually throughout the centuries, and a real negative attitude toward the medieval period, this middle period, middle between what becomes the question, but it's viewed as an era that's pretty well despised among Protestants. And as you move into this time frame, you realize there are multiple players on the table, the multiple individuals who are vying for change, vying for particularly religious change. And first and foremost on our list is the Lutherans. Martin Luther obviously is the leader, primary leader among the Lutherans, although Melanchthon takes up a lot of authority and control, largely due to the fact that Martin Luther was sought after for death. And so what are they emphasizing? Well, they're emphasizing language, scripture in the people's language, justification by faith, having a personal relationship with Christ. And this language of evangelical really has its beginnings in this time frame. Evangelical means gospel. It means committed to the gospel, the good news. And the good news of justification, the good news of a relationship with God is very much a part of Lutheran passion, and in contrast to the salvation model that was represented by the Catholic Church and its sale of indulgences and things of that nature. They popularized the Bible. Obviously, one of the first acts that Luther does following the Reformation's beginning is to translate the Bible into German, and that's important. And they retained a lot of the traditions of the church, though certainly not scholasticism, not allegorical interpretation, and not the historical episcopacy, which obviously is a factor. And so this is a sharp break that takes place in Lutheranism. Calvinists, which makes up a large body of and diverse body of followers, we would have Presbyterians, we would have Puritans, we would have people who call themselves Reformed. I think Reformed was probably the primary title of those who were followers of Calvin. Congregationalists would get down to the point where they would be autonomous local churches. And then Zwinglians eventually would be wrapped up into, and Calvin would overtake the Zwinglian reform. And the Zwinglian reform would sort of flow into Calvinism. And one of their principles was this: everything the Bible does not expressly command is prohibited. And so it rejected everything not expressly commanded in the Bible. And so what does this do? This eliminates most tradition. Some people on the other side of things would say whatever the Bible doesn't explicitly prohibit is allowed. And you can see how those two different approaches would result in very different approaches to scriptural interpretation and even the formation of the church. And Zwingli was very strict there, and Calvin sort of inherits some of his influence in that regard. A third group is the Anabaptists, and you would put in there Baptists, Brethren, Charismatics of all sorts, pretty much free church tradition, local church autonomy type traditions. They deny there's any continuity in the historic church. The historic church has failed. There's been heresy, and they reject the creeds. They reject much of the history of the church, especially all of those quote unquote man-made elements of the church. Vestments, Eucharist, all these types of things. And they want to just go back to a church that's represented in the New Testament and does not have these elements that were later produced, such as creeds and episcopacy and those type things. And so everything is reduced down to a local level. The humanist, I think I always want to be defensive here because the humanists of this period were not the secular humanists of David Hume and others of the 1800s. What we're really looking at are Christian humanists, people who believe that we should study the ancient sources, a lot of positivism about how we can change the world and change society through good practices and good thinking. And you can see how there's a continuum here with the rational aspect towards liberalism and even Unitarianism. And so what are they identified here as introducing scientific study of old documents and traditions and emphasize the ethical teachings of Jesus. And obviously these are primary things of import among them and things that are positive things that can be drawn from the Christian tradition, even by people who are very liberal in their theological bent. Roman Catholicism, in its own counter-reformation. I don't think they called it that at the time, but we would call it a counter-reformation that they were going through, a time period in which the Catholic Church was reorganizing and trying to give some type of response to to what had happened on the continent, all of the negative dimensions of the Reformation that had happened. And they lost a lot of control, lost a lot of lands, although they retained a lot. They retained Spain, they retained Italy, they retained a large portion of France, and even into Germany. And so it's not like the Roman Catholic Church failed and rolled over and died. That's a very improper understanding of what occurred in the Reformation. So as they went through their Council of Trent, which started in 1545 and went through 1553, so they met successively periods of time over that 8 or 9 year period, they rediscovered scripture, tradition, reason as foundations for the church's theology. Mystical experience was also accepted and included. And all of this is part of their own reform, and they end up being a very missional, very progressive, and obviously anti-Protestant tradition, where basically they agreed to a stalemate, a warring almost factional stalemate in this time period. A little bit later on, you go through a period of wars of religion in Europe, and it ends up being very devastating as they are opposed to each other. So Anglicans, where do we come in here? Anglicans were influenced by all five of these movements. Catholicism and Protestantism both play a major part in the formation of Anglicans, and even Anabaptists. The reaction to Anabaptists shapes where Anglicanism goes. David Holmes wrote a book called A Brief History of the Episcopal Church. I'm going to be quoting sections from this. He has a good summary of the Reformation in short format, which is helpful. He said, Anglicanism is not necessarily Protestant. And I think sometimes that's surprising to people because we do think of it as a Protestant denomination, but it isn't Protestant in the same sense as other denominations were. In some ways, it was charting its own course. Deeply influenced by Protestantism, deeply influenced by Catholicism, but somehow trying to chart a middle way, retaining continuity, which is very important, with the historic Church of England. And so I think he's correct here in saying this. And yet it was also birthed in this time period of Reformation and defined itself in juxtaposition to all the main movements of this time period. And yet the history of the English Reformation, as this notes say, however, was not entirely edifying. There was a lot of negative impact, and sometimes it goes back to Henry VIII and his desires for an heir and his multiple marriages and these types of things. And they're not always our proudest moment as people who identify with the Anglican Church. So let me get into the time period, walking you through just some key events and key situations that help us define what the feel of the English Reformation was. In 1521, you've got a lot of influence coming into England regarding the Reformation on the continent. Lutheran books are there, pamphlets are there. This is the primary way that I think the Reformation succeeded, as opposed to some of the prior reformations of the medieval period. The printing press was instrumental in the success, and Luther knew how to use it. Cambridge students, Cambridge was a very important university at this time, and Cambridge students were very interested in the Reformation ideas in juxtaposition to Catholicism. And a study group apparently formed at the White Horse Tavern. There's some debate about this, whether there's any historical records related to it. There's not a lot to support it in terms of tangible evidence, but it's pretty much believed that this was a happening. Thomas Cranmer was very much likely a part of them, although in other early reformers, as were some defenders of Catholicism. Henry VIII wrote a book in this time period, 1521, on the sacraments against Luther. And because of his defense of the Catholic position on the sacraments, the Bishop of Rome gave him a golden rose and named him the defender of the faith, which was a mark of pride for Henry. And he is a theologian as well as a monarch, and obviously a strong Catholic at this moment in time. 1525, you find Henry, who's had received earlier permission to marry Catherine of Aragon. She had been his brother's widow, and it was claimed that she was a virgin even as his brother's widow. And he had to receive a special permission, a dispensation, to marry her in the first place. And he was very upset because she couldn't bear him a son. She did bear him a child, Mary. And this was also the year that Henry met very pretty Anne Boleyn. And this began what's called the King's Affair. And so he's having an affair with Anne Boleyn. He wants to divorce and annul his marriage with Catherine, didn't want to divorce her, but wanted to annul. And the Bishop of Rome would not comply. He wouldn't annul Henry's marriage to Catherine, largely because he was deeply indebted to, but also perhaps even a prisoner of Catherine's nephew. And so the interconnections you can hear between the political and the religious, he couldn't just make a decision on religious grounds and religious principle. Politics were deeply in play. And he was very much beholden to the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and who would be Catholic. 1526, Cardinal Wolsey is providing at a mass burning of Lutheran books. And so you can see that Henry and his cardinal, the Archbishop of Canterbury would be very much opposed to Lutheran ideas and very much in support at this time of Catholicism. Thomas Bilney, who is suspected to have been one of the people at the White Horse Tavern, respected Cambridge preacher and Lutheran sympathizer, was dragged from his pulpit in 1527, and he's burned at the stake in 1531. Simon Fish, he's a London attorney, amateur actor who'd fled to Antwerp after spoofing the clergy. He was trying to be captured, but he tricked them. And he wrote a pamphlet called A Supplication for Beggars, which urged an end to taxes for Rome. This would be very much against the Catholic Church, and which survived upon taxes in order to supplement its income from the realm. And Henry VIII liked this book. Henry was getting a little bit more and more distance from the power struggles of the Bishop of Rome. 1529, Henry VIII decides he did not need permission from the Bishop of Rome to have his marriage annulled. Probably this was Thomas Cromwell's idea, who was his chief minister. This is not the same as Thomas Cromwell not the same as Oliver Cromwell. This is Thomas Cromwell and not Thomas Cranmer. You may get these names mixed up a little bit, but this is Thomas Cromwell, who was his chief minister. Henry declared himself head of the English Church, whatever that meant at the moment. He forcibly cut off the Anglican bishops off from communion with Rome, so they weren't supposed to be corresponding and be controlled by them. He called a new parliament, a Reformation parliament, and he married Anne Boleyn. And service at churches, however, remained essentially the same. Henry's still Catholic. The Mass was in Latin. There was no sermon or systematic Bible teaching and reading, such as was going on, say, in Lutheran churches on the continent. People were passive and received Eucharist only at Easter, getting only the consecrated bread. So it would be the priest receiving for the people, and them only getting the host at Easter time. David Holmes calls Henry's church autonomous Catholicism, independent of Rome. So it's still Catholic, but somehow he wants to declare himself independent of Rome, and therefore it's a self-ruling Catholic church in Great Britain. And he would put it almost on the equal par with what Eastern Orthodoxy would be autonomous body off to the side, breaking away from the Catholic Church, although I know that's not how Eastern Orthodoxy would posit it. 1532, 1533, Thomas Cranmer is made Archbishop of Canterbury. And he is one who was pretty much on Henry's side on the issue. He's willing to be on Henry's side on the issue of his annulment. It effectively ends clerical celibacy among Anglicans, because Cranmer was married 2 times. And so he had been in, I think, Wittenberg, and studied Lutheranism, and Luther was married, and he got married. And so all these individuals are breaking the pattern of clerical celibacy. The Act in Restraint of Appeals prohibited any bishops in England to appeal to the Bishop of Rome. And so this begins to break. You get a solid breaks in the relationship between Rome and Canterbury and the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England. Winfield Bevins, his book, Simply Anglican, he suggests Henry and Thomas basically used one another to accomplish their own personal goals and ambitions. They were very different individuals. They had very different internal commitments, but they had external objectives that it was useful to each of them to use each other. Henry was still decidedly Catholic inside. I think he was greatly conflicted to make this move away from the Catholic Church. He would rather have had the Bishop of Rome annul his marriage, but he needed this annulment and to stay legitimate. And so he moves his church away, and Thomas Cranmer wanted to accomplish the Reformation. And he knew he couldn't go so far. He could only go so far into Henry. So they used each other, and they accomplished their own goals in the process. 1534 becomes the set date of the break between Catholic and Anglican. 2 major acts are are approved this year. The Act of Succession. There are 3 acts of succession. This is the first act of succession. And it was basically passed in this year, and it made Elizabeth Henry's successor and declared Mary illegitimate. Now, some of the later ones, acts of succession, I think in one case, Elizabeth becomes illegitimate. And so these problems here, but this was a strong declaration that Mary was not, the marriage was annulled, Mary was illegitimate, his next successor would be Elizabeth. And of course, this is before Edward is born. Henry also in this year passes the Act of Supremacy, and it requires everyone to swear allegiance to him as the supreme head of the English church. Now, this language, supreme head, as long as I guess maybe a male is in place there, it is somewhat acceptable, but there was still some opposition to this title because the only head of the church is Jesus Christ. And so a lot of the reformers did not like this language and title, but it did, pronounce Henry as having primacy over the Church of England. Thomas More, Henry's prime minister and author of Utopia, and John Fisher, he was a very saintly bishop of Rochester. They refused to swear, and so they were individuals who Henry had beheaded in the next year. 1535, Henry VIII beheaded Fisher and More after the Bishop of Rome made Fisher a cardinal. That was quite a tit-for-tat offense. Fisher refused to swear, and so therefore the Bishop of Rome makes him a cardinal. And so what does Henry do? He cuts his head off. Henry had sorrow over this, and probably genuine sorrow over this. His court wore mourning attire for 2 weeks. Henry had intended to execute Mary, his daughter, by Catherine, who also refused to swear. And the person who dissuaded him from executing Mary, his own daughter, was Thomas Cranmer. And I put irony here with an exclamation point because, as you know from later history, Mary is the one who has Thomas Cranmer put to death. And so here he is dissuading, he saves Mary's life, and Mary takes his life a little bit later on. 1536, Henry VIII executes Anne Boleyn and marries Jane Seymour. And he continued to oppose the introduction of the English language Bible for his people. So here's just a little note here, just to give you a feel. He's doing all these different things, and he's sort of lost his way in terms of marriage and family and children and things of this nature. But he's still resistant to Protestant reforms. One of the major principles of Protestantism was getting the Bible into the language of the people and going away from Latin. And he is still opposed to an English language Bible for his people. And so you have people trying to produce these Bibles outside of Great Britain, or even in Great Britain under great cover. And so when you find that next note, 1536 in Brussels, William Tyndale had to leave England and went to Brussels. And he's a priest, he's a Lutheran sympathizer, and he's responsible for producing an illegal English translation of the Bible. And he was actually strangled at the stake and so put to death. So Tyndale died before his project was fully completed. His last words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And so here's Henry. Here he is, 1536, leading the Reformation, breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church. But at the same time, he's not reformed in his own spirit, in his own theology. And so he's sort of this mixed individual. And there are a lot of mixed signals all the way through his reign that indicate this complexity of Henry. He's not a simple person. He's theological, he's very Catholic, and yet at the same time, he's also bound by institutions of the monarchy and how it operates, and desiring to have succession that would be favorable to a direction he wants things to go. So he's in a tough spot in some ways. I want to give a little bit of sympathy for this man who sometimes gets a very bad portrait. 1536, Henry VIII ensures the permanent popularity of the English Reformation by abolishing the monasteries and sharing the loot and land with almost everyone. And this begins to raise up a gentry class within England, another class. And so you have these people who are benefactors of this. Henry really did this to gain monies for his treasury, but also to pay off some of his wars that he's had. And note it, at the time, about 1/4 of all England's landed wealth was owned by religious houses and by what were Catholic houses. And so when Henry abolished them and dismissed, I think he had some provision for the people who were there to have their needs met somewhat. But this was a major land grab, and this land was distributed among uh, upper classes in British life. 1538, John Rogers, also known as Thomas Matthew, printed the Tyndale Bible translation, which was finished by Miles Coverdale in Paris. You know the name Coverdale from our Psalter, and he did the Old Testament, and is sometimes called the Matthew Bible. It was approved by Henry VIII as the Great Bible to be read by all his people. And so I gave you a link here to give you a little bit of the history of the English Bible. Some people did not like this Bible, and so there's a lot of controversy over Bible translations at this time. But anyway, Henry gave approval to it, which was quite significant. It shows some evolution in his own thinking. 1538, Jane Seymour dies following the birth of Henry VIII's only legitimate son, Edward. And one of the notes I have here, just to show you Henry's complexity, is that he assigned Protestant tutors for both Elizabeth and Edward, an indication that he was conflicted and not entirely against the Reformation. And what this did is it really instilled in both Edward and Elizabeth a favor towards and the flavor of Protestant Christianity. I think in some ways Elizabeth was somewhat conflicted because she had Roman Catholic leanings as well, and so she liked the stateliness of Catholic worship, and yet they both had some Reformation theology instilled in their person by their tutors. 1539. 6 articles, and notice all the ones in blue here in your notes, they're linked, hyperlinked to articles, some on Wikipedia, some on Encyclopedia Britannica, some related to various biographical resources that I want to link you to, but gives you a chance to follow up on some of these things and get a little bit more information about them if you're interested, and it helps you broaden your awarenesses here. But these 6 articles were passed against Lutheranism, trying to reduce disunity. One of the things really all rulers depended upon in terms of religion was that religion would somehow bring unity to empire. That was one of the reasons why Constantine, right here, Constantine sought to preside over and call the bishops together at Nicaea because he wanted unity in Christianity, because he was shifting away from the Roman pantheon to give unity to the empire to Christianity. And so there's a sense in which religion ends up being a source of unity that rulers depend upon. And so as Lutheranism was causing all kinds of divisions in England, Henry attempts to stamp it out, even though he just had a year earlier approved an English-speaking Bible. So he has contradictions here. Hugh Latimer, Bishop of Winchester, resigned in protest because he was very much leaning towards Lutheranism. Cranmer, who always has this sense about him that where he has tremendous loyalty to divine right of kings and would sense that somehow God's will is with the king and you shouldn't rebel against him. And so you find him really struggling here with Henry, later on with Mary. I think part of the reason why he recanted his Protestant position under Mary was due to the fact that he believed in the divine right of kings and that Mary was his queen, he was his monarch, and he was obligated by God to obey her. And so he's a conflicted person in some ways. So Cranmer remained loyal to Henry, even though Henry is making these laws against Lutheranism, which Cranmer has some favor toward. Henry VIII was still occasionally burning Lutherans and hanging Roman Catholics, and I'm sure this was also a conflicted thing for him as well as Cranmer. 1540, Henry VIII marries and divorces Anne of Cleves, and all in the same year, executed the now unpopular Thomas Cromwell, who was his chief of staff, and he marries Catherine Howard. 1543, Catherine Howard was beheaded, and Henry VIII marries Catherine Parr. And so you have all these Catherines and his experience, and Henry's just off the rails in some ways. 1544, Cranmer was instructed to write prayers and litanies for the army in English. And so he does this, and he begins to utilize some of his skills in writing, his prose, as well as his liturgical resources. And he did this so well that he was asked to make a prayer book in English based upon the service at Salisbury Cathedral. I gave you a link here to Salisbury Cathedral because this cathedral was one of the most important churches in Great Britain, along with Canterbury. And it's an amazing, beautiful Gothic structure that you should be aware of. 1545, Henry VIII's last speech before Parliament, before he dies. And in this speech, he says, the Papists, the Roman Catholics, the Lutherans, and the Anabaptists are names devised by the devil to sunder one man's heart from another. And so he hates disunity. And so he has a very strong spirit of detest for Roman Catholicism, Lutheranism, and Anabaptists because they're causing such division within Great Britain. That's 1545. Actually beginning in 1545, but I have the date 1546 here because the actual meeting is taking place. The Council of Trent is meeting. I give you a link to that. It's meeting in Germany. And this was the Roman Catholic Church's Counter-Reformational Council, which meets over this 9-year period between 1545 to 63. All the bishops who were in communion with the Bishop of Rome came together, and they decided that the church venerates equally the Bible and the written and unwritten traditions of the church. And this is in direct contradiction to the reformers who were rejecting tradition. The reformers were venerating the Bible over and above all tradition. If they had any respect for tradition, it was always the Bible in supremacy. And so you have this equal veneration, equal respect for both as authorities for the church. And this is a very important statement. It directly confronts Luther and all the reforming voices. This was the beginning of the Tridentine Church related to Trent, today's Roman Catholic Church. And England was becoming a haven for Protestants from the continent where Roman Catholicism was having a resurgence. And so England has a lot of Protestants coming to it. 1547, Henry VIII dies. Over his time period, he executed around 60 people for religious reasons, among a total of about 130 political executions. And so a lot of people died. He is a monarch who has to maintain his unity through his means. He was succeeded by his very sickly teenaged son, Edward VI. Before, I think I mentioned to you that the monasteries were confiscated. There's a word that starts with D. I can't remember the term, but anyway, they were confiscated. In this case, the chantries or educational houses were also suppressed, and this was another source of lands and monies that were sort of being used to fill the coffers of the treasury. Henry's passing allowed the reforming impulses to assert themselves, and this would include Cranmer. This would include some of the other reforming individuals who became counselors to Edward, and in some senses were actually ruling through him and guiding him. So with that, the prayer of humble access was added to the liturgy, the Latin Mass, and the Mass was still in Latin at this time. Images in 1548 were ordered to be removed from all the churches by the Council of Regents. This also meant no vestments, no ashes, no palms, no holy water or crucifixes. this caused so much resentment that in order to suppress all preaching followed. And so here we have very much a anti-Catholic bent and reaction and moving away from it. And so you can hear the Lutheran, the Protestant, uh, that which the Bible does not affirm should not be allowed, bent that was going on at this time, and Zwinglian influence in that sense. In 1549, Cranmer's first Book of Common Prayer is published. It was a project that had a committee of 12 individuals and along with Cranmer, but it was mostly Cranmer's work. It was introduced on the day of Pentecost in 1549. Its sources were the medieval Roman Catholic Mass or Missal, Eastern Orthodox liturgies of St. John Chrysostom and St. Basil, Lutheran liturgies that were being produced on the continent for Lutheran churches, and other Christian liturgies through the centuries that Cranmer took, revised, fit together, and maybe reorganized by his theological bent and his genius for liturgy and language, and it became his product. It was written in English, which is very important. It's not Latin. Emphasized the people's participation in the Eucharist so they could partake of both kinds. Required the Bible to be read from cover to cover, so a complete lectionary of biblical texts. And fast days were retained, supposedly to help fishermen. I'm not sure fully all of that. I guess they fasted by eating fish. But saints' days were not. And so saints were not, and you can hear that's in their Protestant emphasis. Some areas ruled by London, yet not English speaking, resented the prayer book and the English Bible as imposing the English language. And so I think in this note primarily of areas like Wales, maybe Scotland, Ireland, some areas that had their own vernacular. They felt like they were being imposed upon, moving away from Latin to English as being that being imposed upon them. And there was some resentment in England over that requirement. 1550, there's a new ordinal. This is the way of ordination and ordaining, laying hands on of religious individuals. And it required that a Bible be given to all newly ordained bishops, not a staff, and to the priest, and not to them Eucharistic vessels. So the Bible becomes primary. You can hear a strong biblical focused Protestantism emphasis here. A bishop by the name of Hooper, this is called Hooper's Visitation, surveyed all the parish priests and found them concerned about their work, but very poorly educated. This was something that was taking place even before the Reformation began, so the late 1400s into the 1500s. A lot of individuals were very poorly educated, and they were in priestly roles. And so a lot of times they did not preach. They only just recited the Mass, and they had it memorized very likely. And so there really becomes a stirring to make sure that all these priests receive a good education. And one of the reasons why, as we move forward in the Reformation, one of the things that was produced for a lot of these priests was a book of homilies, a book of sermons. And these sermons were written by individuals like Cranmer, Hooker, and I think Lancelot Andrewes, I think, wrote a number of them as well. And what they did is they laid out very strongly Protestant theology, and the priests who could read at least could read them verbatim to the congregation, so that at least there would be some proper preaching to the people, so that the people could receive the truths of the Reformation in their context. But this 1550 Hooper's Visitation revealed how poorly educated these priests were, even though they were enthusiastic and very concerned about their pastoral roles. 1552, the Book of Common Prayer is revised. And again, this what was there before was Cranmer really writing most of it, producing most of it under Henry. And now that they're freed from Henry's influence, they're suiting it more towards Protestant ideals. So there's no more real presence at the Eucharist. There's a statement, there's a section called the Black Rubric. And the Black Rubric prevented and prohibited certain Roman Catholic leanings, such as it did allow kneeling, but it goes against the real presence of Christ. There are no vestments, no signing of the cross at confirmation, no holy oil, no reserved sacrament, no prayers for the departed, no lifting up of the host. All these things were prohibited. So it's a very strong movement towards Protestantism and almost a Puritan type emphasis. Puritanism is going to come on the scene in another few years as we see it. 1553, you have the production, and this is Cranmer's work, of the 42 Articles of Religion. I have a link here that takes you to the 42 articles, but also to the 39 articles, and it gives you a comparison of what what is included in their number. A lot of parallelism, but when you get to the 39 articles that are produced under Elizabeth, some of the edgy anti-Catholic and say Anabaptist elements are reduced some, and maybe a little bit softening on Calvinism and some of these other things. But initially, this 42 Articles of Religion drafted by Cranmer, very strong Calvinist influence in them, as Cranmer was much freer at this point in time to pursue his Protestant ideals. And this is a very important document. It is approved by Parliament, and it becomes the doctrine of the Church of England. And so you've got the Book of Common Prayer and the 42 Articles, and then you have English Bible. And these things are foundational to what becomes Anglicanism in this time. 1553 in Geneva, one of the things that Calvin, I think, was probably most regretful about was that he participated and consented to the burning at the stake of Michael Servetus. Servetus was a Unitarian, denied the Trinity, and he'd fled to escape the Spanish Inquisition because he was a Protestant, and he was very liberal, and obviously in his theology. And liberals lost their illusions about Calvinism, that any way Calvin would have any type of a appeal to them. It was lost by this persecution and assassination, I guess in some ways you could say, of Michael Servetus, 1553. Just to say, in the midst of all that, the Reformation had a lot of aberrations, and a lot of Anabaptists were put to death as well, a lot of them by drowning. If you ever read some of the stories of the Anabaptist movement, The Anabaptist Story by William Estep is a fascinating read. Obviously, I read that in my Baptist days, but these individuals who died for their faith, that they believed so strongly that the Catholic Church and the other Protestants were basically giving people false assurance of salvation by baptizing infants, that they were willing to die so that these people would not be deceived through infant baptism. Now, I have my own theology of infant baptism now that includes incorporation into covenant and the need for, and the setting apart of that person by the Holy Spirit. So it's a dynamic epiclesis, calling upon the Spirit to set that child apart. But the Anabaptists were killed for their strong conviction about baptism. And that impacted not just religion, but it also impacted state religion and churches keeping records of births and baptisms, all these types of things. And everything's interconnected and very complex. And using the tools of state, burning somebody at the stake for not holding to your religious position. That's pretty strong. 1553, Edward VI dies. People were tired of Protestants looting the churches, and so in some ways there's this Protestant, when it was called looting the churches, they basically were removing anything that was golden ornaments, and even whitewashing the churches and painting them white over all the beautiful icons and other things that were there. It was just a removal of the candelabras and the candles and anything ornamental. Protestants wanted things very simple, very plain. And so there was this resistance and rejection of this almost iconography, the iconoclasm, I should say, where you are destroying icons. And so Mary Tudor comes to the scene, and she's a very strong Roman Catholic, and she's going to restore a lot of these things. So in some ways, there might have been some sentiment in favor of her, and yet some of her extremes during her 5-year reign ended up being very unpopular. She became Bloody Mary because of her strong persecution of Protestants. So she's a militant Roman Catholic, popular at first. She made a number of blunders, one of which was marrying the hated Philip II of Spain. Spain is Catholic. Spain is tied in with the Bishop of Rome. And so when she marries him, there's this fear that he, as a male, is going to dominate Great Britain's politics. And he was hated for himself and hated for his Catholicism. And now she was bringing his influence into the court. Her persecution of Protestants began. She appointed new bishops and fired all the married priests, which were a lot. During her reign, about 300 Protestants were burned, including 5 bishops, 100 priests, and 60 women. Nearly 800 clergy and laity fled to Geneva and other Protestant cities on the continent as part of the Marian exiles. Now, these Marian exiles went there for the 5-year period when she was in reign, and what they picked up in Geneva, what they picked up in Wittenberg, what they picked up in some of these Protestant cities, they brought back with them as stronger Protestants following her death. Her cardinal was Cardinal Pole, and her Archbishop of Canterbury, and he tried to restore monasticism, but it didn't succeed. It fizzled. When among about 1,500 surviving monks, nuns, and friars, fewer than 100 were willing to return to celibacy. Many had married, many have abandoned their vows of chastity, and so it just wasn't a successful project. And all of these things together pretty much ensured that Roman Catholics would remain unpopular in England. There were many Catholics there, but they were unpopular because of a lot of Mary's activities and reforms. One of the most marked events of Mary's persecution of the Protestants was the 2 bishops, Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, bishops of Worcester, I should say, and Rochester, respectively, burned at the stake on October 16th. A very important day. Both of them in the burning in the stake made a strong attestation to their faith and their trust in Christ. Latimer is attributed with saying the following quote, "Be of good cheer, Master Ridley, and play the man, for we shall this day light such a candle in England as I trust by God's grace shall never be put out." And so play the man, and very strong, courageous. And these words become emblazoned in the conscience of the people of England, and it become almost rallying calls to stand up against tyranny, to stand up against persecution, and a hallmark for Protestantism, almost like remember the Alamo and these other expressions that become emblazoned in people's minds. So Mary burns these bishops. In 1556, she's dealing with Thomas Cranmer, and she persuades him. The language here is brainwash, but she persuades him. And I think Cranmer is a participant in this, partly due to the fact that he does believe in this divine right of kings and queens. And so what does he do? He signs a private retraction of his Protestant views that he's held and that are represented in his articles, as well as his Book of Common Prayer. And later on, he repudiates them in public. He felt compelled to obey the monarch of England due to the doctrine of divine right of kings, and Mary burned him at the stake when he refused to make his public recantation on March 21st, 1556. And so his claim, the claim of the language was this hand that signed this recantation, he placed it into the flame and allowed it to be, really burned, as first part of his body to be burned because it had betrayed his, I put my left hand, I would imagine it was probably his right hand. But anyway, so a dramatic event as well, and a marker of restored courage after his recantation. 1558, Mary dies childless, and this is means that the succession goes to Elizabeth. And it's kind of interesting. Cardinal Pole, who was our Archbishop of Canterbury, died just minutes after her death. And Elizabeth I is a Protestant. She became queen, and she began her 45-year reign. Now, when you hear somebody reigning 5 years, they can make an impact in 5 years, but it usually isn't a total change. It may not have great longevity. When somebody reigns for 45 years, that person's impact is enormous. All the appointments that they make, all the positions that people become loyal to them, and they continue their influence, and they deeply embed themselves and change the whole structure of society and government. And Elizabeth has that type of influence. There's a lot of problems, including assassination plots from Roman Catholics who are trying to kill her. She supported the enterprising middle class, and England prospered. And when things are going well and things prosper and things come to peace, even in terms of religion, you're going to have a popular response, and people are going to go along with you and the things that you want. She opposed fanaticism on all sides. She did not like persecution, and so that there is some. She does have some executions during her reign, but it's not as extensive as what her father had or what her stepsister Mary had. She opposes two aspects of extremes. She exposed Calvinism, basically because it's republicanism. Calvin held to a very strong sense of localized representative governance in the city council of Geneva and in the church, which develops into this presbytery model where you have elders within a church and they govern as a body. And so she doesn't like that because that doesn't mesh well with monarchy, nor does it mesh well with bishops ruling multiple churches. And so she doesn't like the Calvinism extreme in some of its theology, but she's also opposed to Catholicism with a couple of very important reasons why. One, she was tutored by Protestants, but the Pope had excommunicated her father Henry and had also declared her an illegitimate child of a concubine. And this does not settle well with her, with Catholicism. And you can see how that's probably the case. And so here she is, this person who's very, I think, probably comfortable with Catholic practice and Catholic forms, and yet at the same time not comfortable with some of the Protestant reforms. And so she's got this in-between position. So she's almost the perfect person to advocate for a middle way, a middle a via media between Catholic and Protestant, and to define what becomes the Anglican Church. I didn't reference an article to Matthew Parker, but he's ordained as the Archbishop of Canterbury and leads this reform with her. Her grand achievement has been called the Elizabethan settlement. This is something you should know about, should be aware of, and what the various elements of this are. It obviously involved her act of supremacy, her act of uniformity, which required all churches to observe the Book of Common Prayer and use the Bible. And also the 39 Articles become a very important part of this. And they basically define a very centrist position that was not decidedly Catholic, not decidedly Protestant. Some people call it a Catholic form with Protestant theology, although that may be a little bit overstating. David Holmes, I think, had a wonderful little quote here, and I put this in here. Desirous of national unity and confronted by a nation that may have been, and he says there can be no exact figures, 1/3 Protestant, 1/3 Catholic, and 1/3, much like herself, in desiring an end to doctrinal contention, she attempted to create a national church that could blend Catholic and Protestant elements and steer a middle course between theological extremes. And I think that's a good, healthy statement regarding of what achievement Elizabeth had as she brought about this Elizabethan settlement. When she's got major factions of Catholic, major factions of Protestants, and major factions of people who just wanted an end to all this controversy and contention, she founded a church that could somehow be a middle way between these extremes and represent the reform that was needed, but also maintaining the continuity with historic Catholic, in the best sense term, faith. So her first act in 1559, it started in 1558, but passed actually in 1559, is her act of supremacy, which established her as supreme governor. Now, her father was the head of the Church of England. She called herself the supreme governor, which was a much more diplomatic. Elizabeth sometimes is called a politique, someone who knows how to work her way in a way that's not going to cause a negative reaction. And so she achieved her end by moderating this title. And so she's the supreme governor of the realm in all spiritual, ecclesiastical, and temporal matters. And this is received, this is accepted. The Act of Uniformity was passed and reflects Elizabeth middle way, the via media between Catholic and Reformed extremes. The Book of Common Prayer was revised, taking away some of its extreme Protestant views that had taken place in its second revision. And how did that take place? Elizabeth reintroduced the surplice. So you have clergy wearing surplices, explaining it was the clergyman's uniform. She eliminated the black rubric, which took away the real presence aspect and allowing some mystery to be in the Eucharist. A special license was required to preach, which meant that anybody who was not authorized was illegally preaching. And I think this is about the time period, if I'm not mistaken, look it up, when John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, was in prison. He actually wrote Pilgrim's Progress in prison as an illegal preacher. And there was no church music except metrical psalms sung to ballads. But what you have is a very uniform. This form is required all throughout the realm of England. And you're supposed to use the Revised Book of Common Prayer, 1559, and all these features are in place. And so it becomes settled. And she reigns for 45 years. And so this becomes standardized. And even though there might have been some initial resistance, over time it becomes very much part and parcel of how worship works. Although you're going to have a period a little bit later on where the Puritans try to stomp this out. 1560, Saints' Days are reintroduced, so we do recognize saints and value them along with Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Maybe not exactly the same way, but Saints' Days are reintroduced. I named for you one of the chief theologians of the time period, John Jewel, and you can read an article about him, but he wrote an apology for the Church of England, which basically defended Anglicanism against Roman Catholicism. And his major contention in it is that Rome, not England, was schismatic. The Roman Catholic Church had lost its way. It had gone away from the foundations of Scripture and good tradition. And the Anglican Church was basically on that proper course. And so it's Rome that's in schism, not England. And England was just going back to what it should be faithful Christianity. And so John Jewel is a very important theologian. A little bit later on, I'll introduce you to Richard Hooker. And Hooker basically has an apology in his writings against not Roman Catholicism, although he does address Catholicism, but it's really against the Puritans who are trying to derail this Church of England project and want to go to a Presbyterian type of form in their own methodology. But that's a little bit later on in time. 1563 is the third part. You've got the Act of Supremacy, the Act of Uniformity, and now the 39 articles, a revision of the 42 articles. And you can refer back to that earlier link to read about the two. And it was drafted as a doctrinal statement by the Convocation of the Church of England. Holmes calls these articles, I love this title, masterfully ambiguous. Masterfully ambiguous. And what he means by that is that they purposefully express the language on contentious points of theological division in ways that people could interpret it how they wanted to. And so when it came to predestination, if you're a predestination person, you could read it and say, yeah, that represents my view. But if you're more Arminian, you could read it and say, okay, I can accept that. And on the Lord's Supper, if you have a very high view of the Lord's Supper, you can embrace that. Or if it's just a real presence, then you can accept that. I don't think it would go so low as to say it's just symbolic, but you do have the capacity within the language of the 39 articles to find your position there, even though some people who you might consider your opposites theologically can also find their position in that same language. And so he says it's masterfully ambiguous. And he would call that a good and purposeful thing. They did that purposefully, which is part of the bent of Elizabeth and part of the bent of those who were leading with her in this reform and this Elizabethan settlement. And so in some ways you have this beautiful blending and a place to bring harmony, although there are some outliers who are going to be contentious here. Anabaptists, number one, and then Puritans, number two, who do feel like monarchy should go away, and they also feel like bishops should go away, and all the forms that relate to Catholic compromise in their mind. 1563, same year, you have Fox's Book of Martyrs written. It's published. It's really a political piece as much as a religious piece. And the Bishop of Rome is portrayed as the Antichrist. And Fox wrote speeches for the Protestant martyrs, such as Thomas Cromwell, and put wonderful words in their mouths about their Protestant theology. And it's very much anti-Catholic, very pro-Protestant. There's some martyrologies also written from an Anabaptist perspective that are very not just Catholic, but anti-Lutheran, anti-Calvinist, and because they're the persecutors of them as well. And you have some of these pieces. They're not just purely religious books and writings. They are purposefully written to defend a position and to exalt martyrdom, which obviously martyrs provide seed for church and movements. One of the worst things to do if you ever want to make change in a culture and society and you have an opposition group is don't make a martyr, because when you make a martyr, you embolden people. The last note here is 1568, the Archbishop Parker produces the Bishop's Bible. Now, this just goes to show you that the English Bible is still very much in a process of formation and acceptance, and there's really not one that's setting the place to become the people's Bible. For the Puritans, a little bit later on in time, they do have a Bible that they have. It's called the, oh goodness, I can't remember, it's not the Great Bible. We just saw the title Great Bible. But at the same time, and you have in 1611 coming up in another 50 years, you have the production of the King James Version of the Bible. And that becomes, along with the Book of Common Prayer, very complementary to be utilized in all the English-speaking churches. And it takes the day, especially for the Church of England. So I'll stop with that. A lot of interesting things to consider and think about, and maybe even write some of your own thoughts about. Very interesting mixing of politics and religion in this period, and yet Elizabeth coming through in a very important reign of 45 years to establish some uniformity and set structures and patterns and a spirit that I think pervades and prepares the way for the future of the Church of England and its success, not just in Great Britain, but really around the world, and having enduring influence as maybe not a Protestant, part of Protestant, but maybe a fourth way, a fourth branch of Christ Church. Lord bless you till next time.